I'll tell you.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Pro Democracy podcast. Today, we have two very special guests. We have Esperanza and Brigid, who you may have seen getting yelled at online. But we are bringing them on because we think they have some very valuable voices on the issue of sex work. And for the last two episodes, we were talking about foreign policy. And what I've really liked about both Esperanza's and Brigid's analysis is when they talk about sex work and the sex trade, they're thinking beyond the imperial core and thinking about how this issue connects to imperialism as well. And so I did think that it is very relevant to our show. And I also thought that we would discuss the OnlyFans controversy, as that's something that Brigid recently wrote an article about and something that has been very abuzz. So with that, welcome on to Esperanza and Brigid. And we're going to be, I think we can just dive right in. So both of you have written a little bit about how imperialism and the sex trade are connected. Esperanza, you've written about, you've kind of taken an internationalist stance on approaching sex work. And so what is it that people in, say, like where we are in the imperial core need to sort of understand in our discourse about sex work?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you again for having us on. I'm a huge fan of Brigid, and so to be on with her is also very great. I think that one of the most important things for people in the imperial core to understand about the sex trade, which I want to make clear, I do not use the term sex work because I do not believe in the neoliberal political project that the term was created for. But I think that people in the imperial core need to understand that for the vast majority of people, especially women in the sex trade across the world, they are not there because of choice. They are not there because of autonomy or some, liberal feminist vision of empowerment. They are there because of coercion, because of violence, because of imperialism, because of colonization, and because they are oppressed due to their gender, their class, and their nationality. And so in the imperial core, it's very easy to lose sight of that because we are so inundated with imperialist propaganda, like propaganda from Rudyard Kipling, where we believe it's the oldest profession, that it's always existed. That's a lie. Or pimp lobby propaganda, which really originates from here, the center of imperialism.
Yeah, I think with that, I like there's also a sort of role with global NGOs. There are big advocates for, I mean, when I've used the term the pimp lobby, everyone's gotten upset with me. But there is definitely a sort of like in the progressive NGO circles, we have, I think the guy from Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth. We have like Amnesty International. We have the Open Society Foundation, all sort of pushing these very liberal capitalist ideals of the sex trade. And so it's interesting when you kind of back up and look at it from an international lens, because we also have seen how these organizations have played a role in sort of diminishing the self-determination of nations in the global south as well. And so do you guys see
Regime change Roth,
regime change
as we
Roth?
call them.
Yeah. So is there a connection there? Is there a reason why these NGOs are so are really taking on this issue?
It's a few things kind of combined. And firstly, I want to point out, because people are going to be listening to this and be getting kind of heated, and some people are going to be listening to this and won't be able to catch me saying this, but I want to make it very clear that when we criticize the industry, we're criticizing the industry as a capitalist industry and not individual people operating within the sex trade, right? Like, I want to make it very, very clear for everybody listening that we are critiquing an industry just like we criticize every other capitalist industry that there is. And for some reason, this topic of the sex trade, it seems like an untouchable area of the left. Like people refuse to critique it, by and large, which is a huge problem in itself. And this inability to critique the industry is being utilized and weaponized by the capitalist class in order to profit big time, right? So we have these institutions, like all the ones you just listed, Mila, we have the IMF, the World Bank, and they are giving loans to countries in the global south, right? And how do these countries pay off their loans? A huge part of that is through tourism. So, what can they do to promote tourism in these countries? The IMF and the World Bank and other organizations similar to that will push this pro legalization or full decriminalization propaganda, not only here in the imperialist core, but also throughout the world. This is like a ideology that's the liberal ideology is spreading, in order to legalize things like prostitution all over the world so that sex tourism will be more of a thing. The countries will be bringing in more monetary value and then being able to pay off the IMF and the World Bank. And it's, yeah, the paper trail is all there.
Yeah, of course. And there's a huge connection. And, it's funny because I do think, people are very in denial about it. Or I think, when you think of the voice of people who have worked in the sex industry, it's usually somebody that is like in the imperial core where we are. We very rarely hear voices from those who are impacted by sex tourism.
If I could real quick, I think it's interesting you brought up the role of the IMF and the World Bank and handing out these predatory loans. These are both institutions which are based out of Washington. They're also, controlled by Washington. The U.S. has veto power over policies at these institutions. The president, I think it's the World Bank. It might be the IMF. So forgive me if I'm wrong. I've reported this before. You can go back and find that to know if, to fact check me. But the U.S. president picks the president of the World Bank. So, they're supposedly independent institutions, but if you look at like the way that they're structured, the U.S. basically controls them. As far as the NGOs and their role advocating for the decriminalization and all that, these are this is a violation against the sovereignty of women. And these are the same institutions, the same NGOs, which consistently advocate against any country that asserts their own sovereignty. So there's an interesting parallel there between the sovereignty of women and the sovereignty of nations. So I just think that's really worth pointing out. If anyone wants to tack onto that.
They'll frame it as like a progressive values campaign, right? To try to do full decrim and legalization anywhere. They'll frame it however they need to in order to attain the capital that they want. Like you said, by using women and children as cannon fodder all over the world. Like they really don't. There's no moral basis for this. It's all capital.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to know, so when you talk about the connection between Washington,
Esperanza, we can't hear you too well.
Your sound is a bit muffled.
Sorry, can you hear me better now, or it's still?
Maybe even a little bit closer, like right here.
You're on the mic.
It's really hard to hear you.
Mm-hmm.
I think she's changing her microphone. She's muted herself, I see. So we'll just give her, 10 seconds to fix that.
It's going to be really good, guys. Like
she's got a hot take coming. It's on the burner.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, better.
Better? Okay, sorry about that. So I just wanted to say, when you brought up the connection between Washington, the IMF, and the global sex trade, I think it's really important to point out what is the Washington consensus for the world. It's neoliberal globalization, economic liberalization, and privatization, right? What is neoliberalism? It's a return to classical liberal ideology where there's minimal state intervention, minimal state regulation, and the free market inherits, all the things that they're moving away from the state. And so we need to think about that, and also what Rosa Luxemburg said about how capital will eventually, seek to expand and industrialize informal sectors. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing right now with this global movement to expand the sex trade. It's seeking to industrialize this informal sector. It's seeking to make big, private profits off of it. And it's seeking to put the sex trade, as well as those of us, specifically women trapped within it, put our fates under the hand of the free market.
Yeah, that sounds pretty like on point. And I think it's very interesting to me because all the things you're describing are things that traditionally the left wing, so-called left, I mean, Alex and I have talked about this before, like we're like, what even is left anymore? But traditionally, like you would think that when you're describing this phenomenon, the left would be, saying like, yes, that sounds pretty terrible. We need to oppose it. But the consensus of the Western left does not seem to be that at all. And so what makes this an exception?
Well, if you don't mind me speaking, I think that like leftism has become like, it's kind of like Martin Luther's 99 Theses, right? You have a set of morals that are like coded into this ideology rather than like having a materialist approach to understanding the world. It's just a set of rules that like, A is good, B is bad, C is good, etc. When we talk about the Western left, I mean, most of these people, unfortunately, have very little experience outside of their class and outside of their national borders, unfortunately. I remember when I lived in DC, I met a young woman who identified as a sex worker. And, I was asking her about it, and she told me that she sold her panties on Craigslist. When I came to Mexico City, I was talking to Esperanza about this maybe a month ago. I took a 20-minute Uber ride recently, and there was a street where there were a lot of actual sex workers, people who have sex for work, right? And in the course of this 20-minute ride, I saw 50 women dressed up in dresses, lipstick, makeup, standing outside storefronts. And I think that like Western leftists don't have experience with that material reality. I don't want to be too hard on them, right? Like I think that a lot of this comes from a good place. Maybe you guys disagree, but they're very ill-informed. At the same time, they want to attack people like us, or attack people on the right who are also ill-informed like them, yet they suffer from the same underlying cause of their frankly bad opinions. Really quick, before we continue this conversation, I do want to say that we are taking down the Periscope. We're inviting everyone to join us on Rockfin. That's rokfin.com/prodempod. You will need to subscribe to view the rest of this conversation, and I hope that you guys do because it supports our channel. So please join us there. I'm going to end that stream now. And Mila, if you want to take over for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so I think Brigid has something to add before me. So go ahead.
Sure. Sorry about that.
Esperanza first.
No, if you could go first, Brigid, and then I'll pick up after you.
Okay. So yeah, to your point, Alex, what really did it for me, because I have my own experience in survival sex work when I was like 21, escaping a really like abusive, financially abusive, physically abusive relationship. And my experience, although a lot of horrible things happened to me due to my involvement in that, I was able to exit because I have the ability to do so. But a few years ago, I moved to Mexico for about a year and a half, and I lived in a small town, and I lived on the outskirts of town, like on a road that didn't have a name. My house didn't have an address or a mailbox. Like that's how far out we were. But the center of town was like a big tourist area. Like people from all over the world come. And in my neighborhood that was like on the outskirts of the town, I would walk through it and I noticed that there were actual child brothels that were operating in my neighborhood, with young girls, like 8 years old, standing outside to lure men. And these are all indigenous Mexican girls, mind you. Like, this is all indigenous community out there. And I noticed this and asked my friends who are from there, and I was like, what the hell? Like, what is there anything that we can do about this? And they basically looked at me and they were like, no, there's nothing that you can do because the police, like, they're in on it. They work with the cartels. Like, there's nothing you can do. And then I remember vividly also driving through Mexico City when I would visit Mexico City, and the same thing that you're describing is what I would see. And it was all indigenous Mexican women, like, forced onto the street in this way, in a way that is just more in your face than what we see most of the time in the US.
Yeah.
Or more in your face than I've seen in the United States. And I've been to a lot of inner cities. And that was kind of really my, like, oh my God moment when I realized that there's way more to this than I previously, like, had the conception of, and how common it is, how frequent it is, and how it's literally everywhere.
It's out there, yeah.
It's literally everywhere. And here our conditions are just so that we see it's not as in your face, but it's still there. It's just not as in your face. And so that stark contrast really was pivotal for me in my political development on this subject, you know.
Yeah, and you know, in response to the question of why are so many quote leftists unquote, why do they get it so wrong on this issue? I think that there's a few reasons. I think the first is that there is this countercultural idea that, you know, our society was founded on Puritans, on Christian religious moralism, and therefore, in order to be free from that, we have to go the exact opposite. So if, you know, society is preaching, you know, chastity for women, then women will get free by being promiscuous or etc. And they don't understand the fact that, you know, the regulation of women's sexuality and prostitution, or monogamy and prostitution, are two sides of the same coin. And so the pendulum can flip one way or the other. You know, conservative women claiming their freedom comes through, you know, chastity, regulated sexuality, and liberal women claiming the exact opposite, that their freedom will come from embracing the sex industry, pornography, hookup culture, promiscuity, whatever, you know, achieves the male orgasm. And so I think there's that incorrect analysis. And it makes sense because, you know, pro-sex trade activism really started with Coyote, or call off your old tired ethics. And so it saw the principal contradiction as, you know, the ethics of the old society versus the new sexual liberation ethics of the new society that they're trying to create. But then I also think that there's something a little deeper, which is kind of what Andrea Dworkin was saying, which is that leftists hate capitalism until the commodity is a woman's body. And, you know, if you study history, you see that class society was only made possible because women's sexual and reproductive capacities were commodified. Women's sexual and reproductive capacities were controlled, owned, sold out, and exploited. And because of that, slave society, the first class exploitative society, was able to rise from that. And so as those of us on the left are trying to fight class society, fight exploitation, the idea that women's bodies are a commodity that men, although under capitalism anyone should be able to access by using their wealth and power, that idea is so ingrained in our society, in our history, in our culture. And it is very difficult to get rid of that idea. But it's necessary if you do not want your movement to be futile and ultimately fail.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what you're touching on is also there's like a common, I mean, I guess I have 2 points here. And the first is that I really do think that people are seeing this as a sort of resistance to conservatism. And I mean, I wrote an article about this and that received like people don't like to hear that. And that's something that I learned from publishing this article. And to me, it seems very akin to the way that conservatives like to own the libs. This is like liberals owning the evangelicals or owning the conservatives. But the problem is now is that these conservatives are not the ones with the cultural power anymore. Maybe this was the case like 15, 20 years ago, but right now we have a pretty liberal, socially liberal consensus as that time has come and gone. But your point also to me kind of touches on this common sort of saying where people are arguing that, well, like sex work or prostitution is like any other job. And so the only thing that makes it different is the stigma and the illegality. So what you're kind of saying is no, it had a very different development from, making sandwiches for a living, so to speak.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's again what people miss is that, this idea that, oh, it's like every other job. I mean, it's trying to make a very complicated issue very simple, and it's trying to conflate it with everything else. We know that, for example, when looking at capitalist states, capitalism develops inequally, right? It's not this equal process, right? Like there is a lot of inequality in capitalism. So why can people not see that there is inequality between industries, inequality between things we do for money? And if it is like every other job, then let's look at the working conditions. If I'm a line cook, because I'm working around hot oil, I am much more likely to get burned by hot oil or a hot plate than I would be working in an office. Whereas if I'm working in the sex trade, then I am going to be far more likely to be raped, robbed, assaulted, sexually violated, etc., than any other job. So it's not the same thing at all.
Yeah, and I think
I will.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, like, I just think the collapsing of, like trying to make it a simple thing, as well as this sort of attempt to, like, this postmodern attempt to stick it to the right, where it's like, like, no, you only think that this is different because of your so-called Puritan morals, and it kind of, even it's a bit dishonest because the critique from, say, the Marxist perspective is not coming from the same place. Legally speaking, for instance, the opposition, like the conservative sort of opposition, wanted to frame it as a legal nuisance, right? And so, like, the issue is like, oh, we have like people soliciting sex on the street. This is a street nuisance. The issue that Marxists have is clearly not that. The issue is not that there is a nuisance, there's an aesthetic issue. The issue is about economic exploitation.
Yeah, if I could just add real quick, I'm glad Esperanza brought up the parallel or the difference between traditional work and sex work, so to speak, with the position of a line cook, because I've been a line cook, I've worked in kitchens, and I saw how badly women had it there in the kitchen, where they were getting sexually assaulted all the time, verbal sexual abuse all the time. And so if you can imagine how bad it is in that line of work, you can start to understand how bad actual sex workers have it. And the unfortunate thing is that if you try to add any nuance beyond sex work is real work to this conversation, you get attacked for it. I'm sure everybody on this stream has been attacked pretty hard. The only times I've ever spoken out about it, they call me an incel, which is like hilarious because they can't imagine like a guy that has this nuanced position and also like isn't like afraid of sex, isn't some kind of like Puritan, religious Orthodox person. So I just wanted to add those two things because it's one of those conversations, and there are a handful of them that I've experienced. China, Syria, for example, are other ones. But this is definitely up there for the conversations that if you speak out on the wrong side against the left, they will attack you and they will insult you and never address any of your actual criticisms or the facts that you bring to the discussion. They just want to shut it down because, and you have to wonder, is there either a financial or personal investment that they have in this? And I, especially with this topic, I think that there is, I think that a lot of men on the left really, they romanticize sex work and maybe are, Johns themselves.
It's the one feminist issue they'll involve themselves in.
Right.
Like, they won't really advocate for abortion or for ending female genital mutilation or like they won't advocate against domestic violence, things, really basic things.
When
But
was the
they'll
last
be
time
like,
you heard something about equal pay? I'm sorry for interrupting.
no, I mean, it's the one thing that they feel justified supporting because it benefits them directly. And to your point, Alex, as well, when we're talking about conditions, I just want to bring up how bad the conditions for sex workers has been during the pandemic, particularly people who are prostituting. The level of coercion, which obviously already existed, has just skyrocketed through the roof because what happens is, first of all, imagine if you're talking about like protections in the pandemic, the amount of PPE that a prostituted person would be required to wear, it would be like a full hazmat suit if you were to actually protect yourself during one of these transactions with John. The coercion gets even worse when during the pandemic there are fewer people who are willing to risk going and engaging in this sort of transaction. So people are forced to engage with men that they would typically prefer to refuse otherwise if given the option. Not only that, is like they'll be willing to accept lower pay for the transaction. They'll be willing to do more sexual acts that they would prefer not to otherwise if given the option. Men are pushing like not using condoms more because they know that the women who are being prostituted are being coerced into accepting these conditions because the other option is starvation. Right? So and then like these men don't care about whether or not they get you sick. They don't care about whether or not they give you COVID. On top of that, who are the people who are the army of labor in this sector? It's the most marginalized of every community. It's women of color. It's people with mental health struggles and like addiction struggles. It's people who have had no support their entire life. And it's mostly women, trans women. Like, it just blows my mind that the left cannot see this very blatant structure and setup that children seem to be able to recognize.
Yeah.
Right? Like the propaganda we're under is just like insane. It's crazy.
Yeah. And I think that it goes to show too how disconnected the mainstream left is from reality and their inability to engage with the masses, because the masses of people understand, like when I talk to other women, other trans women in prostitution, they understand at a very basic level how it's exploitation. Many of them have dreams that they constantly talk about wanting to get out of it, wanting to have a chance at a real love life, working a normal job, not feeling like a commodity or feeling like some freak that people use at night under, the dark in a closed room. And yet you have these so-called leftists, really liberals over here, trying to tell them, oh no, you chose this. Oh, I know that you're facing violence, but if we expand the legal rights of the people committing violence against you, that will stop the violence. And somehow these people sometimes believe it and get organized.
And people will post all year long about how many trans people are getting murdered, and you get like monthly updates of how many people are being murdered. And they don't look and see that most of these people that are murdered, these women are getting murdered in hotel rooms. Why is that? Or with missing and murdered Indigenous women, people will talk about that, but they don't. Most liberal leftists do not want to address what the cause of a lot of these murders are, and it's because these people are not viewed as they're viewed as like less than human by this industry and by these men. And I would just really love to see more people speaking up about this. So I'm really glad that Mila and Alex invited us to do this because it's extremely important.
Yeah, well, we're happy to talk about it. And I think, one thing that um, I've kind of seen as well is I really think the US and Canada to an extent is very influenced by libertarianism. And I kind of see this as someone who used to be a libertarian. We've all, had some questionable phases. But, I see this coming a lot from anarchist left, who is very similar to the libertarian left. And the sort of like you were talking before about conceiving of the transaction as coercion, right? Because the option is starvation or, doing the act. Um, and I think under the sort of libertarian philosophy, it just would not be coercion. It would be a sort of voluntary transaction. Coercion's only if it's like at the barrel of the gun. And that is, that is the conception of what coercion is. And I do think the American left is extremely influenced by libertarianism because the US itself is, its constitution is, its sort of political culture is very libertarian as well. And so there seems to be like, okay, because even if you're talking about jobs, right? Like if you're talking about, people who like there's this new sort of idea where like people are not working now and people are getting mad like, oh, no one wants to work. And there used to be this sort of philosophy of like, well, if you don't like your job, why don't you just move? And now you sort of have this idea where, okay, no, you have to work. I am entitled to have people work for me. And similarly, I think, wealthy men think they are entitled to purchase women as long as they have the money to do so. It's a very sort of similar owner and owned dynamic.
Yeah, if I could. Oh, do you want to go, Esperanza?
No, I just wanted to say real quickly, I think that the libertarian influence on the left is extremely destructive and negative and needs to be struggled against. I also think the anarchist influence, even though there is a rich anarchist tradition that opposes the sex trade, especially like ecofeminist anarchism, but even Bookchin himself opposed the sex trade, like the Institute for Social Equality.
And Lucy Parsons too. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Emma Goldman and Lucy Parsons both wrote against prostitution because obviously it's an issue. Sorry, could go on.
Yeah. No, they did, right? But I think like when we read like Stalin, for example, and he says the cornerstone of anarchism is the individual, whereas the cornerstone of Marxism is the masses, whose emancipation is the principal condition for the emancipation of the individual. And so to, libertarians and anarchists who live under neoliberalism, the idea is that the individual right to sell yourself or to sell somebody else is more important than the collective right of the masses of women, trans people, queers to not be sold into prostitution. And so I think we're seeing that contradiction between the individual and the masses when we see the contradiction between libertarianism, anarchism, and socialism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so we've been talking a little bit about like the libertarian anarchist view on all this, but I see the same kind of approach by social democrats, like DSA types, for example. And I don't know, you guys could feel free to disagree with me, but I feel like a lot of that has to do with what I was saying earlier about that moral code, right? Where like, okay, like leftism means supporting minorities, queer people, and sex workers, right? The most marginalized in our society. And so yet they advocate against their interests. Why is that? Well, I think that their exposure to sex workers are generally like the kind of upper class sex workers that I talked about earlier. Where you had this woman selling her panties on Craigslist, no actual contact with the sex buyer, right? So I think that it's worth noting it's not just the anarchist libertarian left; it's also the social democrats, and frankly, a lot of Marxist Leninists are buying into this stuff too. So I don't know why. I don't really understand that. I'd like to. If anybody has any opinions on that, feel free to share them with me. There's a lot of things that the MLs are doing lately that don't really make sense with my understanding of Marx or Lenin. So that's an interesting question that maybe we could explore later.
I mean, I have some thoughts, but I really think a lot of leftism right now is a clique mentality, like from the catchphrases that that the left is putting out. And I think, Esperanza kind of called this out the other day when Cory Bush was like sloganeering about sex work and being like, you're literally an elected politician and you're just like putting forward the sloganeering. But I think, with my experience on the left, especially like the campus left, like even people who are like, I'm far left, Marxist, radical, whatever, there are orthodoxies that you have to repeat. And that is like, I think, this notion of the consensus on sex work has to stay, even if, you might personally think it's unsound. You see the kind of harassment people get for speaking out on it, and you also get told you're like an impure leftist or feminist or whatever. And so there's a sort of consensus that you need to belong to be a part of this clique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you don't, you'll just get canceled by your friends. Like, who wants to lose friends over this, right? So it's it is a very strong silencing tool. Like, you have to fall in line. Even if you don't agree with it, like, I can't tell you, in being public about my position on this, how many people will DM me and say, thank you so much for speaking about this. I cannot, like, I got one of those today from somebody I know in Portland, and they were like, I just literally, it's hard because I can't say anything. I'll get canceled and name called, and like the whole town will turn against me. It's really one of those things.
Yeah, protect women until they have the wrong opinion, then we come with the torches and pitchforks.
Yeah. And, to answer your earlier question, Alex, I don't listen to how people identify themselves, because being a Marxist is not like being gay. You don't just get to say you are and we all believe you. Like, I'm going to analyze your arguments, and your arguments are going to tell me what you are. So you could say you're a Marxist, you could say you're this, that, whatever. But if your arguments collapse into individualism, into subjectivism, into idealism, if they are completely disconnected from material reality, from historical reality, then your analysis is not Marxist, no matter what you call yourself, because Marxism is not a self-identification. It's a way of analyzing the world and changing the world. And we can objectively say whether or not something is dialectical materialist or Marxist or not. And in terms of the DSA question, I think this is part of the problem when you're in an organization with absolutely no ideological or political unity. The DSA often chases after social movements. So, Black Lives Matter comes out and protests for an entire summer. And then after, the DSA releases a resolution or something that just mirrors all the language that was said in the protests, whether defund the police, but they don't add any socialist analysis. They just parrot it like a parrot. The Open Society Foundations and George Soros fund this movement to decriminalize the sex trade, and they do really good online propaganda. And then the DSA thinks, oh my God, every single person in the sex trade wants to decriminalize pimps and sex buyers, so we should come out and support it. Zero socialist analysis, zero talk of imperialism, zero talk of history. So I think like that's one of the problems too, is that yes, they're social democrats, but they're also not only eclectic, they are scattered, sporadic, and rattled. And so their analysis usually just tails behind whatever slogan is popular at the moment. Right now, it's sex work is work. In 10 years, it's going to be something different.
Mm-hmm. I'm worried about what it's going to be in 10 years, to be honest. But I do think that's true. I feel like a lot of it, and like I can sympathize with this as like someone who had gotten into, like I think the first time I got really into politics was like through libertarianism, and like minus like the anti-war stuff. That was way earlier, but conversation for another day. I really find that like a lot of politics is like people wanting to like rebel against the ideas of like their parents, or like they're not necessarily like their literal biological parents, but like the ideas of a previous generation. And so, if you're raised like with people who are really conservative, then, you get to say something like sex work is work. And like that is sort of sticking it to that ideology. And so it's like similarly, if they're hopping on Black Lives Matter, like a lot of them are probably like, you know what, like my parents are racist and I want to rebel against them or whatever. And so that's kind of the issue. I really do think there's a lot of like personal motivation when it comes to jumping on these politics. But I sympathize with it because I get it,
Yeah, I used to be an anarchist for like 15 years. I was my parents are right libertarian, so I was raised with this very like individualist, fuck the government, fuck the police, but from like the right perspective, and a lot of that mirrors the left libertarian ideology. And like you said, I really do think it's a overreaction to the paternalism of the church, is what a lot of it seems to be. But when you have that far of an overreaction with no analysis under neoliberal society that you're just drenched in for your entire life on this earth in the imperial core, it's really hard to get any sort of materialist analysis like through the propaganda.
Yeah.
But yeah, relatable. Yeah. I can relate as well.
Yeah. And with this issue in particular, what's so frustrating about it is that people say, oh, it's this movement that's critical of the sex industry is, all coming from evangelicals, but they ignore the fact that the first sex work is work organization was literally funded by a Christian church. The Methodist Church and Playboy were the two funders of Coyote. Okay, so it's like these people don't even know the history of the church and the position that the church took. I mean, even if you read Sylvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch, you'll see that at certain points the church supported the legalization of prostitution. So the world is not as simple as they think it is, where church says this, therefore we do this. The church has said a lot of things, and anti-Christianity is not an ideology.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting too that like there are a lot of like American Christianity is not the be all end all of Christianity either. Like it's funny because I have talked to a lot of Middle Eastern Christians, and like they're way less focused on like the sexual politics than the American Christian right is. Like, they're focused on like the rich history of the land and like the connection of Christianity to the land. They're focused on like the spiritual, like intellectual aspects, but they're not like I haven't seen anything quite like the sort of US political landscape and Christianity and the way that it's been sort of obsessive about sexual politics. But I think, it also kind of comes from like the way that the left approaches it. Like I said, it kind of comes from a failure to distinguish the reasons why people might critique the sex industry. And I think, one of the things I've also noticed when I was in a lot of left circles is that a lot of leftists have another slogan that people have always said is like, intent does not matter. Like, harm is harm. It doesn't matter what your intentions are. Like, that's not the issue, right? And when you say something like it doesn't matter what your intentions are, then it allows you to collapse like these kinds of oppositions into the same sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting because they say sex work is work. It's just like any other kind of work, but like I can't imagine how many women of our generation went through this pandemic, had to resort to sex work online, and are now unemployable in most industries, right? Because of that. Like, unless you're like Mia Khalifa or something, like you're probably going to have a hard time getting a job. A background check is not going to be in your favor. And that's like, that has lifelong consequences, right? Like I'm not an expert on this. So like, I've never done any reporting on this issue, but I'm sure that there's a lot of women that are going to be struggling for the rest of their lives because of the choices that they made. And I don't even want to use the word choices, but because of the decisions that they made, because of the economic circumstances of this pandemic and going into sex work. And there's no other line of work like that, like besides like working at RT, like me, you can pretty much move from one industry to another. Of course there's barriers that come with capitalism, but no other industry serves as such a black mark on your resume, right?
Maybe drug dealing, but yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Alex, that during the pandemic, there was a 71% increase in signups on OnlyFans due to the severe economic crisis. And the connection between economic crisis and the sex industry is not talked about enough. Yeah. There was a study, for example, in Chicago that looked at prostitutes between 2005 and 2011. And what they found was that every time there was an economic crisis, people were pushed into prostitution and prices dropped drastically. And we saw that with, online sex industry, with OnlyFans, and we saw it being self-reported as well with street prostitution during COVID. And I think, like, even if you find an employer that doesn't care what you did, the reality is that there's a problem with people being pushed into sexually servicing men because of economic deprivation or economic crisis. And even if all of their employers are okay with what they did, those videos, that content, that material is going to be out there forever, and they don't own it. And it's going to be in other people's hands, as well as, your identity and your safety. I mean, so many women who are in the online sex industry have been stalked, have been attacked, have been doxxed. This is a dangerous industry, whether it's in person or online.
Yep,
yeah, I remember when there was that whole, it was coming to a head with Pornhub, and the New York Times ran an article about trafficking victims or young girls, high school age girls who had videos taken by young men of their sex, and it got shared all around their school, and it continued showing up and haunting them, and a lot of these young women were driven to the point of suicide attempts. I mean, this New York Times article in particular is the one that I read, and it was just horrifying. And I think it was good that these banks. I mean, I'm not defending the banks, but I'm happy that Pornhub no longer had that kind of institutional support. Which actually, I'd like to talk about Brigid's recent article, because she wrote an article about OnlyFans and this policy update that they had that was going to bar sexually explicit content. I think you could still post nude photos, for example, but nothing like that was actually really explicit. And since you wrote that article, OnlyFans decided that they were in fact not going to enact this policy. So they kind of like scared everyone that was using their platform. But I think that them reversing that decision actually only bolsters your argument. So if you'd like to talk about your article, Brigid, real quick, I'd really appreciate that.
Yeah, so that article was basically a rebuttal to an article that was written by a man named Andrew Wright and was published in People's World, which is used to be the Daily Worker, I believe, since like the 1930s, is like a old school socialist publication. And all of a sudden I saw that they shared this really interesting pro-sex trade article, kind of defending the existence of OnlyFans on like a moral basis, and claiming that the attempt to take down explicitly sexual content was on a moralistic basis, like conservatism, like social conservatism, basically. And I was just amazed that People's World published an article like that was so liberal, and a couple people messaged me and they asked me to write a response because it was just like so heinous. So I did, but from like an actual Marxist standpoint, I called it OnlyFans never cared about sex workers, kind of just highlighting, because I had been seeing on Twitter and Instagram a lot of people claiming that this was like a moral battle between the liberal left, who like are for freedom, right, and like social freedom and sex positivity, against the conservative right, who were kind of draconian in their view of sex. And they framed it as this like Visa and MasterCard and Discover being owned by conservatives. And that's why they wanted to take off the explicit content on OnlyFans. Like similar to what happened with the discourse on Pornhub having to take down 80% of their content, unverified content last year. So I saw all these moral arguments being made between the right and the left, and I'm just like, how do people not realize that this is all about capital and capital accumulation? Obviously, OnlyFans last year had a huge boom, largely due to the sex trade and people entering during the pandemic, and they're going to be interested in continual growth, right? I think that they've been having issues with investors because, similar to what was happening with Pornhub, there was a lot of content of underage minors being uploaded, like minors with accounts, either forging their information. One person used their grandmother's passport and was able to like get an account on OnlyFans and sell content. Like it's been an issue that school counselors in high schools and middle schools have been like basically catching the students being involved in selling content on OnlyFans. And not only that, but even if you are of age and have a verified account, you can make content with another person who isn't you and sell it on your OnlyFans, right? So you have a lot of underage. We don't really know how many underage people have been sexually exploited via OnlyFans, right? And we really don't know. We cannot know because they didn't have proper age of consent or age verification or consent verification. So this looks really bad to be associated with. Like that looks very bad to be associated with. And so obviously investors, not for moral reasons, but for preserving their own capital, will be hesitant to be involved in something like that. I want to reiterate, it's not a moral thing. It's about capital accumulation.
You're absolutely right. And like the framing of it by the left as a moral issue, like I want to share this picture because can you guys see it? Yeah, here we go. This is, can you guys see it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is the CEO of OnlyFans. This is the guy who founded it. Does this look like a feminist icon? Is like, but the left would have you believe that OnlyFans is a bastion of feminism and that it's empowering women. Does that guy look like he wants to empower women? I just like on a superficial level. That no.
I thought that was Dan Bilzerian when I first saw that picture, like that pickup artist guy or whatever.
Yeah, Tim Stoker, he's the son of a banker. He's just a rich boy. Like, that's literally all he is. Like a pimp. He's one of the biggest pimps in the world, alongside the CEOs of MindGeek, who owned Pornhub and RedTube and XTube and like all that shit, you know?
Yeah. And go ahead, Esperanza.
No, I just wanted to really add on to Brigid's point, which is that, there was an organized group of people who found out how to make these banking companies, how to force their hand on this issue, because they're not going to do it because they care. But this organized group of people found out how to make posting child pornography and non-consensual pornography enough of a liability to force their hand. And you'll find a lot of people,
right? Sorry.
You'll find a lot of people on Twitter, especially with large followings, saying, oh, this was always fear-mongering. There was never child pornography, non-consensual videos on OnlyFans. That's a lie. The BBC conducted an independent investigation and found that OnlyFans was lenient with the legal content, that people could post content of children, of minors, and not have their accounts immediately deleted. Moderators came forward saying that they saw underage people, that they saw bestiality, that they saw incest, and that they saw some of the most exploitative videos, for example, walking up to homeless people and offering them money to get, I don't know if I could say the F word here, but to have sex on camera. I mean, imagine walking up to someone on the streets who is desperate to beg for money and then exploiting them to make money off of them and put videos of them doing sex acts, sometimes gay sex acts when they didn't want to, online. I mean, that's evil.
Yeah, not only that, but
American
also
Psycho.
Revenge porn. Like, we really don't know how much content is on these free porn streaming sites and sites like OnlyFans. We can never possibly know, but there are entire genres on there. It's an entire like fetish genre of people who are filmed without knowing that they're filmed. A lot of times this is prostituted women in hotel rooms or in other places who don't know that they're being filmed, and these men get off on showing their prize. Like, this to them is like success, to show other men what they did. We can never know how many people, like, imagine it just blows my mind how much exploitation people are masturbating to.
This is something that Mila and I were talking about when kind of planning out the idea for the show. I was talking about South Korea, which is, supposed to be one of the most developed democracies in the world. And the fertility rate is the lowest in the world. And at the same time, you have this massive problem of bathroom spy cams, right? And there's been mass protests. Some of the biggest protests in Korean history were by women protesting the prevalence of they can't go to the bathroom in privacy because of these free streaming sites where and like men will put them in the women's bathroom and then it's spread all over the internet. Could you imagine how traumatizing that would be to like wake up one morning, find out one day that a video of you going to the bathroom is like on the internet, and that like, oh, here's 130,000 men have seen this, right? It's horrifying, and this is supposed to be one of the most advanced democracies in the world. But one thing I really want to point out about OnlyFans, and this comes from Brigid's article. I think I'm getting the number right. It's in this ballpark, but she said that the average income from OnlyFans is $186 per month. Well, this year, OnlyFans is expecting $1.2 billion in revenue. That's from an internal company pitch deck that was reported on. So like that just shows you like this is pimping. I mean, it's no different from pimping. The pimp gets rich, and the women who are forced to use this service stay in poverty. They do it to try to get out of poverty, but yet they're forced they're forced to stay there. And then, you know, as I was saying earlier, there's the employment issue after the pandemic ends, right? So again, they're forced to stay in poverty. Like unless you're like one of these people that become so successful with your channel or whatever that you can go get a career in Hollywood or something, you're going to be in poverty. I mean, there's no middle ground, right? So I just wanted to point that out if anyone wants to add.
Yeah.
It's a very saturated market already. Mm-hmm. The same thing happened with filming IRL porn industry, right? Which boomed in the 90s. It was huge in the 90s, but the market became extremely saturated extremely quickly to where now it's really difficult for people to make a living even doing like full sex on camera, like legally like that. It's really very saturated.
Well, when I was writing my article on Pornhub, something that I like, a lot of comments that I had gotten, and I got them recently again because I had this tweet that was circulating talking about how you know, it's very telling that, you know, these pornographic websites cannot like are having like can't function as they're intended to without having to like verify whether, you know, its users are underage, whether they're consenting, stuff like that. And this was an issue in the Pornhub controversy as well. And a lot of responses I have gotten is like, okay, well, you know, every tech platform has that problem. Facebook has that problem too. And it's like, yeah, this is big tech, but there's a sort of inclination to want to talk about porn as though it's not part of big tech, as though it's sort of this little guy that is completely divorced from, you know, what, you know, Facebook does or whatever, when porn has always been a very integral element of the internet. It's not this like isolated phenomenon. It is very much a part of these big tech conglomerates. And so again, it's very absurd to see the left get behind that.
Yeah. And, you know, one thing I want to point out, because whenever we critique the sex industry, there's so much whataboutism. I almost call it like the all lives matter argument, because, you know, we're talking about one thing and then they want to bring everything else. And it's like, we're not denying exploitation exists in other areas. We're just focusing on this right now. But I think one of the big problems is that when we talk about sexually abusive or exploitative material, whether of children or non-consensual material of adults existing on Twitter or Facebook, they will push against regulations for that too. I mean, I don't see why we don't verify the age of people who post porn on Twitter. I mean, plenty of people have reported child sexual abuse material is very common on Twitter. But yet, if you say we should increase moderation, if you say we should verify the age of pornography accounts, then what they'll say is that hurts undocumented women in the sex industry. That hurts indie porn creators. Well, what's more important? Protecting people who do not consent to this or cannot consent to it, or protecting indie porn producers? And so that's how you see their arguments fall onto this libertarian jumbled thought process or whatever.
Yeah, it's very libertarian. And it's funny because I kind of see a lot of this sort of thing, like where people also talk about, like they kind of try this sort of reformism tactic where it's like, oh yeah, like we don't want you to, you know, use Pornhub, just like use ethical porn instead. And it's like, well, is that going to have the same verification problems? Is that going to involve the same levels of coercion? We don't know. There's not really a good way to verify whether people have consented or not. And again, it's very, the lens is very, you know, US slash like imperial core centric in that sort of way as well. In that, like, I feel like the way that we've been talking about OnlyFans is we talk about like it's made this sort of archetypal sex worker to be someone who's like middle class, downwardly mobile, maybe, but like, housed and like has access to a computer to begin with. And this is another thing. It's like I worked at a legal clinic for people in the sex trade, and like a lot of my clients didn't have computers. Like it's not like this is kind of like we're not even looking at the main demographics of impacted people here, where like the OnlyFans thing has made us look at a very small portion of people in this line of work. And for some reason their voices are now the loudest, and I think this is itself a form of chauvinism.
Yeah, I've even seen these articles too that's like, oh, here's like a new porn company, and like the board, the CEO, the president, they're all women, as if like women aren't capitalists ever, as if women aren't going to be exploitative for money. So yeah, absolutely. There's like this idea that you can have these like surgical approaches to these issues that are like kind of all encompassing across the industry, and that those approaches will fix everything when really they just kind of like change who's profiting or mitigate minor aspects of it rather than dealing with the overall issue. And it's supported by social democrats, yet like, I'm sorry, porn is antisocial, right? Sex work is antisocial. So I think that's worth mentioning.
Yeah,
the intersectional imperialism and like girl boss
yeah,
rhetoric right now is through the roof.
it really is. Alex wrote a great article on that, actually, so you guys should, everyone should check it out.
Because as we were talking about the IMF and the World Bank, these predatory financial institutions, they're moving towards finance feminism. Like a lot of their leadership is women, and it's being celebrated. It's the same thing with like a woman-owned porn company, right? It's like, yeah, it's still a porn company though. It's still a predatory international financial institution.
There's female brothel owners all over the world.
Yeah.
Like, because they're also pushed, a lot of them, it's intergenerational too. Like their mothers were prostituted, their grandmothers were prostituted. So you are like socially placed there from birth to like fill that position in society. In a lot of the world, that's just how it is. And we can't hear from these women working in these brothels because they don't have computers.
Yeah. It's very similar, I think, to, the things that Alex and I have been talking about in the last 2 episodes as well, is like, when we listen to democratic voices from other countries, for instance, we are always hearing the people who have the most access to Western media. And similarly, like, this is a class thing that's also exists domestically as well. When we're hearing from people who work in the sex industry, it is going to be the people who have the most access to the media, and that's not going to be the people. It's usually not people doing full service sex work, first of all.
Yeah.
Or prostitution. Yeah. Okay.
And I also just want to point out my intense aversion to the term full service sex work, because because I was a prostitute for a very long time. And when I hear full service, that means you can put your dick in me and in any hole you want, because that's what full service is. And the reality is that prostitutes are constantly fighting against that. Men will come, they'll pay you. We say, you paid for my time, not for my service. So I'm not going to let you do this to me. But the idea that we are full service sex workers means that we provide full service just because we see someone in person. And the reality is that that's a very dangerous way to categorize it, because a lot of women are pushed into anal sex, vaginal sex, other kinds of things they don't want to do because the man expects the full service. And so I know that's like the liberal term we use, but I hate that term for that reason.
Yeah, sorry, I'm still very stuck in liberal terminology. Like even
I just wanted to say that because I feel like that part doesn't get talked about enough. But I just wanted to talk about it.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, and Esperanza was actually posting something the other day on Twitter that was really horrifying about the health effects, the long-term health effects of this kind of abuse. Could you, Esperanza, you're muted, but could you talk about that tweet that you posted the other day about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, once again, right? So like the sex trade is not like any other job where you can walk away from it and hopefully not be left with permanent, disabilities or problems mentally and physically. I have friends who have had anal fissures, who have had, constant anal bleeding because of the amount of times they've been forced to have anal sex, both trans and non-trans women who have experienced this. The amount of times men will stealth us because when you are a commodity, they could treat you however they want and they could push your boundaries because that's what the sex trade literally is. Men using their money to push our boundaries. So they often will take their condoms off and put it back in us. And that could expose us to all kinds of STDs like genital warts, herpes, things like that. And I still have friends who have issues with everything down there because of the amount of times that they've had to open themselves up to men. And it's, the human body, the anus, for example, is not meant to be used by 5 different men a day every day. I mean, you have to think about like how intense the expectation is of what you're going to do and how is that going to affect your body.
Yeah, I mean, and the left has no problem, sticking up for coal miners who have health effects because of, their line of work. But you never hear stories about, HIV/AIDS among prostitutes or other sexually transmitted diseases. I'm glad Brigid earlier brought up the coronavirus in this context because that hasn't been talked about at all. I haven't seen anything about that. Actually, I think I read like one article about a prostitute in Las Vegas or nearby Las Vegas who was like the only one in her brothel that was still willing to work in these conditions. But we don't hear about that. I mean, for the most part, it's labor rights are supposed to be like a big part of like the leftist approach to politics, right? We don't hear about labor rights in terms of sex workers. So I think, as awful as it is to hear these stories that Esperanza just shared, they're so important to talk about.
They're very sad stories as well, but we're grateful that you shared your experience because I think, like people need to know.
Yeah, and one thing I really want to emphasize is that people say if you make prostitution legal, those problems will cease to exist. That is not true. One of the biggest legal industries where these problems exist in like high numbers is the legal porn industry. Like you look at what female porn actors are forced to undergo, where they say I have a hard limit against anal sex, I have a hard limit against gangbangs, against performing with another woman, whatever, and those limits are pushed all the time, and they're told if they want to get work, they have to. And so this one porn actor told me that she was also bleeding from her anus because she was forced to do anal scenes, even though she said that's a hard limit. And that is a legal industry where she technically has legal rights, where she's not criminalized. And it did nothing to protect her from that.
Yeah, if you say no to the scenes they want you to do, you lose all your work. You won't be hired for anything anymore in the porn industry. If you say when you sign up, I can only do this and this, they'll pressure you during the scene to do more and more and more. And if you refuse, they just look at you and you're like, okay, you can't work in this industry then. be gone.
Yeah, and it's the same in prostitution. And that's the biggest problem when we talk about prostitution in an individualist lens, is that we think it's the individual prostitute who has power over what she does or doesn't do. It's actually the market that tells you what you want to or cannot do. When I first entered prostitution, I did not want to bottom for men. That was my hard limit. I didn't want to do it. But there came a point where if I wanted to make money, I had to do it. And every girl knows that. I mean, you could say you're not going to do something, but if you need money, you're going to do it. And if he could go to some other girl for a cheaper price to get it, he's going to do that, and you're going to be left with no money. And so the market decides what you consent to more than your individual will ever does.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, this kind of also speaks to the idea of the chaos of the market in general. And, like what Mark's talked about with like the ensemble of social relations, it's not just that you're subject to the boss's will, it's that even the boss is subject to the chaos of the market. And that's going to be determinative of a lot of ways that the workplace is going to operate. And again, I think if you're approaching this from a free market individualist lens, you're not really going to see that. And I think, again, it really does speak to the sort of libertarian bent that, this issue has, but also just like that the left has as well.
Yeah, during this whole OnlyFans discourse on the internet, when they announced that they're going to be taking down the explicit content, which they have since, as of today, reversed, they will no longer be taking down, or they will no longer be banning the content that's explicitly like sexual. What I did not see in the discourse was people saying, okay, well, what is causing people to be pushed into being on OnlyFans in the first place during a pandemic? I don't see the people who advocate for something like OnlyFans, like the porn industry. I do not see these people addressing the need for exit funding, for exit programs at all. That is not a conception in their mind as something that would be nice to have. And as a Marxist, and I think all of us can agree, that socialism is the pathway to uplifting people out of these conditions. That is what I believe. I am against, on principle, the reification, the commodification of relationships and sex and the human body, right? That goes for marriage just as it does for prostitution as well, right? The only way that we can alleviate these types of things is through implementing social programs. What we saw in the late 80s and 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union, if we want to talk about imperialism here, when the Soviet Union fell, the economic depression that hit that region of the world was worse than the Great Depression in the United States. And what happened to women? A lot of them were forced into prostitution. The phenomenon of seeing mail order brides is what they call them. A lot of that started after the Soviet Union fell. We see a lot of women from Eastern Europe, former Soviet states, who are trafficked into Germany, where prostitution is legal, where they have legal brothels. And the reason why is their economic circumstance. We see most sex tourism happening in Asia. And the reason why is these people's economic circumstance. And I just don't see how anyone can consent to having sex when you're financially coerced into it. And we have a word for coercive sex, and that's rape. It blows my mind that this is not more of an analysis among the left. And the whole trafficking thing has been really, really a focus of the right wing in recent years. I don't know if you all have noticed, but the whole like QAnon thing, the QAnon conspiracy, they're very into like sex trafficking, save the kids, save the children, but from a really mind warped stance. And I think that's also an element of this, is leftists do not want to associate with that.
Yeah.
So any talk of sex trafficking or human trafficking, they want to stay away from that to not be associated with these right-wing people. I think that's also an element of it too. But that doesn't mean that the left should completely ignore all of these people. Like, there's an estimated 42 million prostitute people in the planet, and that was a statistic from 2012. 42 million. And how many of these people are doing it because it's their passion?
Yeah, I mean, and it's amazing to me because we have for the past maybe 3 years, I could be wrong about that exactly, but we have a movement again that's gone viral against workplace sexual abuse, right? We have Me Too. When has Me Too talked about this issue that we've been talking about for the past hour? I mean, it didn't exist. It didn't. I never saw Me Too even talk about what I was saying earlier about like sexual abuse in the kitchen, or like I barely saw it talk about working class sex issues at all. It was about the casting couch, right? It was a Hollywood movement, and the most glaring, disgusting, heartbreaking example of workplace sexual abuse is of prostitutes. And not once did I see that mentioned in the context of Me Too. So, and yet this is the movement that got all the airtime on CNN. This is the movement that, have legislators talking about it on the House floor, right? And no mention of the most abused sector.
Well, I think that speaks to what we were saying like earlier about like a lot of modern day feminism, which is that it's not really speaking for like, again, on a global level for the average woman. It's speaking for women who have access to the media. And I have an article about this on my Substack as well, just about like how the sort of modern feminist movement is it's a way for a very small class of women to advance. It has not been a way of, giving women worldwide more freedoms. And that kind of brings me to something that both Esperanza and Brigid have talked about, which is the right to exit. So both of you have spoken about the right to exit. Brigid, I think, has been doing a fundraiser recently to support that, and I was wondering if I don't know who would go first, but if either of you want to speak to that concept of the right to exit.
Sure. I could go first. I am doing a fundraiser where the proceeds will go to Affirm Hawaii. So Affirm is a transnational feminist organization. They have chapters all around the United States. It is a women of color-led organization, and they do a lot of amazing work pushing legislation that actually helps people in the sex trade, as well as helping people to exit the sex trade. They have been doing an ongoing fundraiser for a long time, especially during the pandemic, for emergency survival funds for people. So basically, I collaborated with two different revolutionary feminist and communist artists who are absolutely amazing, and we designed 4 different shirts that also double as like promo for my podcast, which I haven't really mentioned here. But
We'll give you a
they're
chance.
based on whatever. They're based on Mao, Alexander Kollontai, Anuradha Gandhi, and Thomas Sankara, because I have never seen like good representations of these people in art on like shirts. I actually have one right here, so I'll just throw it up. But so yeah, we have these shirts. And like this one is for Mao, and it says "Women hold up half the sky." It's a famous Mao quote. And these, you can find them at the Big Cartel link in my Twitter bio at Comrade Brigid. All of the proceeds for these shirts are going to be going to Affirm Hawaii's emergency survival fundraiser. So that's just like a small thing that I'm working on right now. It's been absolutely amazing. The art is absolutely amazing. I'm really excited to propagandize in this way as well. So yeah, if anybody's interested in supporting that cause, you can also just go to Affirm Hawaii's GoFundMe fundraiser and donate directly. If you're just like, I don't want a shirt, whatever, just go to Affirm Hawaii's GoFundMe, and I can probably link it in the comments. But yeah, Esperanza, do you want to talk about the necessity for exit fundraisers in general?
Yeah, so, the founder of our organization, my organization Affirm, her name is Ninochka Roska. She says that the right to exit is the most denied right to women, whether it is the right to exit an abusive relationship or the right to exit prostitution. It is the most denied right. Even Kesha, a rich celebrity, was unable to exit a contract with her abuser. So it goes to show you how women are denied this right. In the sex trade especially, we find that women are trapped within it. The sex work is work movement wants to make it like every other job, and they want to erase these specific harmful and destructive effects of being coerced into sex and of experiencing sexual violence. So they say, well, if we're coerced into work, what's the problem of being coerced into having sex? Well, the problem is that means you're being raped. And we know when you're raped, you're going to have a certain kind of trauma that you will have likely for the rest of your life. So focusing on the right to exit is one of the most important things. Well, the right to exit and the right not to be prostituted, because we should all have a right to not be prostituted. And whether you think you got into it because you consented to it or not, you were prostituted by a society that allows an industry to prey on the most vulnerable women and push them into sexual service for men. So the right to not be prostituted and the right to exit are two of the most important things that we could do. And while fundraisers and mutual aid is important, we have to look at how we could do this on a massive scale. And I think in order to do that, it would require us building sort of dual power institutions, like revolutionary institutions, revolutionary governments, that could actually provide these services to people. And in the meantime, fight for reforms that raise and improve the conditions of women, of trans people, etc., so that when we want to exit, we have housing, we have food, we have job vouchers, education, childcare. All of those things are needed so that we can exit.
Yeah, that's very important. And I think that, again, if we are like, that's kind of something else that's missing from a libertarian analysis, and there's no concept of the right to exit. And I think we've kind of spoken to the not having a concept of economic coercion either. And I think of like the first time I learned about like critiques of the sex trade and stuff like that, I was taking philosophy of law, and I read Catherine McKinnon for the first time. And she was debating with a legal philosopher named Ronald Dworkin. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with this debate, but they're talking about pornography. And in the debate, you can kind of see a sort of clear divide there, because McKinnon has said something kind of similar to what you guys are saying, which is, if you're financially coercing someone into sex, like that is rape. And Dworkin's kind of response is like, these are voluntary transactions. Like the pornography in particular is even less of a harm because it's only like an image, whereas McKinnon kind of depicts porn as like a hate speech issue as well. And so I do think, there is a sort of divide there, and I don't really know how that's going to be fixed, because I think, like I said before, like, not to be cynical, but I feel like people really do have strong libertarian inclinations, even for someone like Dworkin, who was like a champagne socialist or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you guys earlier thanked Mila and I for hosting you, but I mean, like, the real credit goes to you two and to Affirm, because you guys are doing like one of the hardest things in the world, which is being open about your trauma.
Yeah, and creating a space for other people to open up if they want to as well, or like have some sort of support system, because for a lot of people who are current participants in the sex trade or even former participants who have exited, they feel like they cannot talk about this. They cannot talk about what happened to them, because if they do, they will be perceived as a swerve, sex worker, exclusionary, radical feminist, right? That's just like a term that's just thrown at you, whether or not you're sex worker, exclusionary, or radical feminist, it doesn't matter. That is like the weapon of choice, and it's a silencing tool, and it's silencing a lot of people who are currently participating in this industry, right? But yeah, I want to encourage everybody to, if you can, develop your analysis of this, or if you already have a developed analysis, to be more open about it, or slowly, gradually expose the people in your community or your friend group around you to these ideas. It doesn't have to be like full throttle right away, but the more people we have giving a materialist analysis of the crux of capitalism and patriarchy, the better, right? Because these are leftist values. These are socialist values. To not commodify relationships, to not commodify sex, and then it blows my mind too. This is kind of like a tangent, but how much in pornography is blatantly sexist, is blatantly racist, is blatantly like just pedophilic and actual reenactments of rape. And for some reason, if you see that in any other form of media, you'll critique it, you'll criticize it, you'll cancel it, I mean, people will just do entire campaigns about how something is transphobic or something is racist. Entire campaigns, but as soon as you log on to Pornhub or whatever, all of your critique, all of your leftist analysis goes straight out the window because you're horny and because you're propagandized. And it blows my mind how much people will accept as long as they keep it a secret. And I really want to implore people to stick to your principles on these very important subjects, even though it's scary.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, and I think like it just again goes to show in a patriarchal society how powerful the male orgasm is, which is you'll have these liberals running around canceling everybody, attacking trans women for saying things about being trans. But the moment you threaten a man's ability to orgasm on racism, on sexism, on non-consensual exploitative material, that is where they draw the line. That is where you cannot critique it. The sanctity of the male orgasm in a patriarchal society.
Yeah, and then like the sort of rebuttal to that I've heard very frequently is that, women watch porn too, and like, whatever, there's LGBT porn, but yeah, you seem to have a response already to it.
Sorry, that is a joke. Porn is produced for men. Porn is produced for men. Lesbian porn is produced for men. Straight porn is produced for men. She-male porn is produced for men. Gay porn is produced for men. Porn is not produced for women. And the small sites that do produce porn for women, they're barely a speck in the industry.
Yeah, no, that is a good point. And yeah,
it's just amazing to me that, over the past 10, 15 years, the term rape culture has been mainstreamed. Like, that's something that we talk about all the time on the left. And then it's just like this massive blind spot with porn and the sex trade. It blows my mind how like, why fight so hard to mainstream this terminology, to just ignore the most prominent and abusive instance of it. It doesn't make sense to me, and it's a real tragedy.
It's a massive blind spot.
I mean, the sex trade is the longest lasting and most powerful institution of rape culture. Like, it existed before, like, commodifying women's sexualities existed before slavery existed. Like, it is the longest lasting rape culture institution and the most powerful one in our society, where it literally turns women and their sexuality into commodities. And yet these hypocritical liberals will just ignore it, like it doesn't exist. Like, there's no, oh no, there's no rape culture in it. Just like you have people lying, yeah, just like you have people lying that there was no non-consensual or child images on OnlyFans.
Yeah, and if you guys don't mind, I'd really like to just point out that this isn't just bad for women; it's bad for men too. I mean, the way that this rape culture or sexist culture affects men, it's a double-edged sword. You know, I think of the talking point like when, you know, you're like in college or something and a guy asks you what's your body count. Not only does that objectify women, but like unless you've also perpetuated this objectification of women, then you're like a lesser man. And so, I mean, it's damaging to both sexes. It's damaging to the whole of society. And you know, I feel like the way that men are victimized in this conversation is also like left out. Even though like we're obviously having a conversation here that like is barely ever had, unfortunately, because voices against this powerful industry, the sex trade and pornography, are marginalized. I mean, it's like one of the most blatant examples of totalitarian control of narrative that these industry players have exerted over us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You know, there was this one former sex buyer who tweeted, trying to buy sex because you crave connection is like drinking salt water because you are thirsty and you crave water. And it's so true. So many of the sex buyers that I would see, were they horny? Yes. But, you know, a little deeper, they wanted a real connection. And it's like, I don't think you feel good knowing that I'm pretending to be into you when I'm so clearly not, right? Or that this connection is a transaction and it ends. So it's like, this really doesn't benefit you either. And then there's another level, which is that, you know, as the sex industry grows and changes, more and more heterosexual men are forced into doing gay acts with other men in order to make money, whether that's you know, having to talk to other men online through OnlyFans, or whether it's turning to in-person prostitution. And then you're going to experience what it's like to be forced to do things that you don't want to.
And then silenced when you speak up against it. And another thing that really gets to me is how if we speak up about this, like I'm sure there will be comments about this talk we're having, and people saying we're puritanical, people saying we're sex negative. There's this whole veneer of like sex positivity. I consider myself to be very sex positive. What I see from this entire industry is only sex negativity, right? This is not an industry that is liberating anybody. It's not empowering anybody. It's not helping anybody find their actual sexuality. It is commodifying. It's taking something, like presenting it as revolutionary or emancipatory and selling it back to you, right? And it just blows my mind that people cannot see how sex negative and antisocial this entire industry is. I could go really in depth about how bad it is for men as well, bad for literally anybody. We did on my podcast called the Probably Cancelled podcast. We did an entire episode that is an interview with 3 Marxist men giving their analysis and personal experiences growing up male in this society, exposed to this kind of content and how it shapes society and shapes your psyche. And that's like, when have we ever heard that perspective before? Usually if there's something like that in the media, it's from like a religious right perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But this is something that men need to be talking about with each other. even
Yeah,
though it's like
good luck.
embarrassing and it's personal. Yeah, it's embarrassing and it's really personal. But that episode that we did was like one of my personal favorites on my like revolutionary feminist podcast, where typically in feminist spaces you're like, oh, don't let men speak, don't let them speak, but we need them on our side advocating with us for our actual sexual liberation, not our sexual commodification. And yeah, I could talk for hours about what it's done to the male psyche of like young boys and growing into men. It's so fucking insidious and it's just so sex negative. So I'm glad you brought that up, Alex.
Yeah. And I think like also the sex positivity movement really needs to be critiqued. I think it's a very reactionary movement. I am not sex positive. Do I like sex? Yes. Do I have a lot of it? Yes. But am I sex positive? No. Because I don't think that my politics should be based on what gives me pleasure. I mean, like, you know, it's like that's just a very silly thing. Like, sex positivity is almost like this cover, which is anything that feels good sexually is like should be embraced and free from critique and is this free choice. And it's just this, once again, complete liberal individualistic analysis. And we need to be breaking away from that. Not everything that you orgasm to is good. Let's talk about why rape fantasies are so common in a rape culture where women are raped politically from their family, etc. every day, right? Because like that, there is a connection there. And just because you orgasm to it doesn't make it okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's also like, you know, this also comes from choice feminism, where it's like, if you choose, like, things that women choose are empowering and good. And so you kind of have that sort of similar mentality. So, one more thing we were going to talk about before we wrap up is this shooting in Atlanta. There was a shooting of the massage parlors there, and there was a sort of discourse going on about sex work and anti-Asian Asian racism. And I think Brigid, you wanted to speak to that. Would you like to sort of recap what happened for those of us that need to refresh our memories?
Yes, so this was in March, I believe. In Atlanta, there was a gunman, an obviously deranged man, who he went on a shooting spree at I think it was three different parlors. It was either three or four. If one of you knows, you can correct me. I believe it was three in the Atlanta general area, and killed a number of people. I think it was people who were working there, as well as like an owner and a couple customers. But it was mostly Asian women who were killed. And then later it was discovered that he was in the media, they said he was a sexually frustrated man. And that's why he went and shot up these places, because he felt he would fall under like the incel category. And he was a former patron of these massage parlors, but what the media did not really report was that these massage parlors were all included on a website. I won't say the name of this website that exists, but there are websites where you can find all of these massage parlors anywhere in the United States and what sexual services they will provide for you. These are profiles that are set up on the site by the owners of these parlors. And they will have lists of the women there. They'll have their ethnicity, whether it's correct or just saying something. And then reviews from customers. If you pay to be part of this website, you can read reviews from men, from Johns who patronize these places, and you can write your own reviews of your experience. There's basically like a human menu that you can choose from. But a lot of the people who are working in these parlors are women who are actually trafficked from Asia. So they will be told in their home country, they will be told by the trafficker, come to the United States, I can get you a visa and I can set you up with work. And so they say, that sounds great. I would love to go there and work and provide money to send back to my family. that sounds amazing. So they end up flying over here. Then once they arrive, they're told, this is where you have to work and this is what you have to do. And there's no getting out of this. This is your job now. And I cannot tell you how common this is. And the fact that there are human menus on these websites that are just allowed to exist. Like, I just really want people to be aware of what's happening in your own backyard, in every city and every town in the United States, and the role that imperialism and poverty by design plays in this overall structure, right? And sorry, I get like really emotional talking about this, but all three of these parlors that this man shot up were on this website. And when we talk about protecting people, we need to be talking about protecting the most vulnerable. These people, and they're working in strip clubs, and they're in porn, and they're on OnlyFans too. It's not just the parlors. But I just wanted to bring that to light.
No, yeah, I didn't even know that about the website.
No, I mean, for all the hot takes and reports that came out about that incident, I never heard about this. So that's really incredible. I think we should probably go ahead, Esperanza.
No, I just wanted to say one of the things that I find so absolutely disgusting about the right wing posing as leftist takes on that shooting are that a sex buyer killed women working at a massage parlor brothel. And you have these Open Society Foundation funded NGOs like Red Canary Song, like Swap USA, calling to legalize sex buying after a sex buyer shot and killed women at a massage parlor that doubled as a brothel. Like, that is gaslighting. It is such a psyop, and I just wish people understood how crazy that is. And the last point I'll make before we wrap up is that we're talking about imperialism. The export of Asian women as a sexual commodity is happening because of U.S. militarization of Southeast Asia, different places in Asia, in which women were turned into prostitutes, into comfort women, and now have been forced to make an exodus over here, whether they're trafficked or doing it because they need to, for whatever reason.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we keep talking about these NGOs that are funded by the Open Society Foundations, because this is kind of like another topic that you're not allowed to talk about on the left.
I feel like we've talked about Open Society every episode now, though. So
it's possible, yeah.
So
but again, if you're just tuning in for the first time, maybe because you're a big fan of Esperanza or Brigid, and I'm sure probably their followers already know, but it should be said that Open Society was founded by George Soros, and this is a man who made his fortune basically being an anti-communist hitman for the United States. So, we're not really allowed to talk about George Soros, but we have to, So thank you for continuing to bring up the role of Open Society in all of this, because it's really underexamined. And if you go to any of the most popular liberal NGOs, activist groups, you go to their financials and you'll see that Open Society is supporting them heavily. So that's like a major thing that needs to be talked about on the left, and it's not. To wrap up, I was starting to say this before I got disconnected. Esperanza and Brigid thanked Mila and I earlier for having them on this podcast to talk about this issue. But I think all the credit goes to them, because they're doing one of the hardest things in the world, which is talking about their trauma. And they're talking about this. They're taking a stance, which is like one of the least popular stances you can take on the left. And they're abused all the time verbally on social media because of that. So just so much thanks to you guys for taking on this third rail topic. And again, if you guys can support Affirm with their fundraiser to help women exit from the sex trade, That's more important than supporting our podcast. We appreciate your tips. Don't get me wrong. I need to eat. Mila needs to eat. She's in law school in one of the very expensive cities in the West. But more importantly, support this fundraiser. And again, Brigid and Esperanza, they're both incredible activists, but they're also incredible writers. Brigid just has an op-ed out on what's the website? Midwestern Marks. Esperanza also writes pretty frequently. Where can we find your writing, Esperanza?
Most of it is on Medium, but just follow my Twitter at N-Class Society, and you'll see me post lots of stuff.
Yeah, and if you guys have anything else that you want to plug before we wrap up here, feel free to unmute yourselves and plug it, because I'm at a loss. But again, thank you for this hard work that you do.
Thank you both so much for inviting us. I also just want to give my thanks to Esperanza herself. I'm the biggest fan of hers. If there was a fan club for Esperanza, I would want to be the chairwoman of that. But yeah, go read Esperanza's work, because literally she, on her Medium site, proletarianfeminist.medium.com or something like that, she gives a very, very thorough, amazing materialist critique that is extremely easy to digest and basically debunks all of the liberalism that we hear on the left. And when you read it, it's going to change you. It's going to, you might have to take a minute to digest it, but it's going to change you and how you view the world. So I want to give her thanks for that. I also want to say, if you want to hear my podcast, it's just a revolutionary feminist communist podcast. We're trying to combat liberal feminism and combat all of these crazy neoliberal lies that you generally aren't allowed to talk about. That's why it's called Probably Canceled. It was kind of like a tongue-in-cheek name, and now we're stuck with it. But I'm definitely canceled. And if you want to go listen to that, you can go to @ComradeBrigid on Twitter or Instagram, and the links are all there.
All right, Mila, you got any? Oh, here we go. Esperanza, go.
I was waiting for Esperanza. Well, I am very grateful for both of your voices. Like I've said before a million times, I had felt really disillusioned with the state of feminism. And for any of our listeners that feel the same way, I really recommend looking at both Esperanza's and Brigid's writing. It is very refreshing in this kind of period in our culture where feminism is has been very self-serving, and Alex brought up the point of their willingness to share their trauma. I think I've written a lot critiquing trauma politics, but at the same time I really think that the way that they really speak sincerely from the heart, and this is it's very hard to do in an era where usually when people are trauma baiting, they're doing it to feed the status quo, and usually the kind of trauma baiting that I've critiqued are the people who will use it against people like Esperanza and Brigid to delegitimize dissenting voices, and that's obviously not the case here. We are so grateful to hear your stories and to really see stories that are untold in the mainstream political discourse. And so we're very thankful to have you two on. I really recommend to our listeners to check out their work, unreal stuff, and to support Brigid's fundraiser for the right to exit.
Support Affirm.
And support Affirm, yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, you guys.
All right. Well, I'm going to end it now. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your tips and your comments, and we'll see you next week.